Hello, everyone. You're watching End Time Counterpoint. My name is Dan. Thanks for tuning in today. Now, in my previous video, I talked about how that John used the correct word in the Revelation when he talked about Jesus returning with the clouds that you see in the sky. And we must give John credit for using the right word that was appropriate to what he was trying to convey, even though the prophecy experts today try to twist and distort what John was actually writing about. But I want to continue on that theme today and talk about the second coming of Christ and how that you shouldn't be deceived by these prophecy experts about what the believers were expecting Christ to do next, and then by extension, what we should be expecting Christ to do next. Now, I'm going to mention a verse that I've mentioned before, and it is found in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 11. And this is where, as the disciples were watching Jesus just levitate off the earth and disappear through the clouds, that two men stood by, and these are obviously angels of God, and they told the disciples that that same Jesus that you have seen go into heaven shall one day return in the very same manner to this earth as you have seen him just go into heaven. So in other words, it's kind of like rewinding a tape. As they saw Jesus ascend from the earth and disappear through the clouds, he will come through the clouds, reappear, and land here on good old planet Earth. So that's what they were told in Acts chapter 1, verse 11. Now, my question is this: would they have preached anything differently? Well, my answer to that is no, they wouldn't. There was no reason to add to this. There was no reason to preach anything differently. There was no reason to come up with any other doctrine. The only thing they would have preached based on Acts chapter 1:11, and keep in mind, this is an angelic message that they had received. There was no reason for them to preach anything else but that the next thing Christ would do was he would return to this earth, just as they had seen him ascend. Now, who was part of the group that heard this message? Well, it was John. And the same person who writes the Revelation was there in Acts chapter 1, and he heard that message. Now, would he have changed the message, altered it, or added to it in any way? Well, my answer to that is no. I think he would have been very consistent in his preaching and his teaching. Now, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, we find that John expresses an urgency, first of all, saying that these are things which must shortly come to pass. I don't think they were expecting it to happen very long down the road. I think they expected him to return in a very short time. I'm sure that they were expecting, based on what they heard from the angels, that Christ was very, very soon going to return. And I think they preached with that sense of urgency. Now, we find in the book of Revelation that John is nailing down that expectation right off the bat. We find in Revelation 1:7 that John says this. He says, "Behold, he, Christ, cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him." Now, the first thing I want to ask you is this: do you believe that that falls under the category of things that must shortly come to pass? Well, I think, yes, it does. So this means then that John is telling the church that very soon Christ is going to return with the clouds of heaven, right? Secondly, we find that the message is consistent, that what they heard in Acts chapter 1 is the very same message that they preached throughout their entire ministry. And what John is telling the church here is that the next thing they can expect Christ to do is to return with the clouds of heaven. So he's obviously talking about the second coming of Christ. He is not talking about a rapture here in Revelation 1:7. Why would he? Based on what he heard in Acts chapter 1. He was there. He heard what the angels told them. That same Jesus that you've seen go into heaven shall in the very same manner return to earth from heaven. He heard that. He knew that. So why was there the need to preach anything else? Well, the fact is he didn't. So that expectation has been consistent. That message has been consistent. because it shows up right here in the first chapter of the book of Revelation. So the million-dollar question is, where did all this rapture stuff come in? If this is the message that they had been preaching throughout their entire lives, then where did this rapture stuff come from? Now, there's no reason for Paul, who comes along a little bit later, to preach anything different. But yet they go to 1 Thessalonians 4, the end-time prophecy experts I'm talking about, and they try to tell us that 1 Thessalonians 4 is talking about something completely different than Christ returning with the clouds of heaven. Now they tell us, or try to tell us, that the church is just going to disappear, even though there's nothing about people disappearing written in the New Testament. Nothing at all. There's not one single place in the New Testament where it says millions of people are just going to disappear. In fact, if you look at 1 Thessalonians 4, it correlates with Acts chapter 1, verse 11 quite nicely. Right? And all you have to do is just run down through the description that Paul gives us in 1 Thessalonians 4, where the angels told the disciples in the book of Acts that that same Jesus shall return. Paul says it's the Lord himself that's returning. Well, that's still talking about the person of Christ. So Paul is describing just a little differently what the disciples were told in the book of Acts. All right, so everything correlates. The message is consistent. What they thought was going to happen next, or what they thought Christ was going to do next, was return with the clouds of heaven and descend to this earth. And that's what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 4. Christ himself is going to descend. That's what the disciples were told in Acts chapter 1. Christ himself is descending to this earth. That's what John says in Revelation chapter 1, that Christ is descending to this earth. And not everybody's going to be happy about it. So you see, the message is very, very consistent. So where in the world did this rapture stuff come in? Well, personally, I think you can thank the dispensationalists for that, people like Darby and then later on others, and people who founded the Dallas Theological Seminary and then sent out missionaries like John Hagee and Hal Lindsey to preach this phony rapture doctrine. It's a fairly recent thing when you put it in perspective. But what the end-time prophecy experts have to do is come up with clever deceptions to make you think that the rapture is actually part of the Bible when it is not. The message was very, very consistent. The next thing Christ is going to do is return with the clouds of heaven as he descends to this earth. That's the consistent message. And there's a verse in the book of Isaiah that really reminds me of what the rapture doctrine and the whole end-time ideology is like. And Isaiah describes a bed that is too short for somebody to stretch out on it, or a bed covering that is too small to cover your entire body. And that's what the rapture doctrine is like to me. It can't cover everything. It just doesn't fit at all with what the Bible teaches. And so what the end-time experts have done is given themselves license to change the meaning of the Bible to suit whatever's going on either in their minds or in the world, and reverse engineer all these things into Bible prophecy somehow. And that's how they deceive. But when you read the New Testament, you'll find that the message is consistent. That the next thing they expected Christ to do was return through the clouds of heaven, or with the clouds of heaven, and descend to this earth, and then finish his work. All right, folks, my name is Dan, and I do want to thank you again for tuning in to End Time Counterpoint. If you like this discussion, give it a thumbs up. Better yet, subscribe to my channel. You can also find my book on Apple Books or Barnes & Noble. It's called Blinded by the Rapture. Just look up the title. You can find it easily. I urge you to get it. And please consider, again, subscribing to this channel. I would really appreciate your help in building up my subscriber base. So once again, folks, I thank you for your kind attention today. My name is Dan. Thanks for tuning in to End Time Counterpoint. I will see you in the next episode.